Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's UW Showcase Talk. My name is Kate Preen, and on behalf of the Wisconsin Alumni Association, Capital Lakes, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, we thank you for joining us on this very, very cold, wintry fall evening tonight. Our speaker this evening is actually Dietram Scheufele. He has a named professorship on our campus. He's John E. Ross Professor of Communications in our Life Sciences Department here on campus. He also has a joint appointment with Arizona State University, so hopefully he gets to go back there soon to warm up. Dietram has done a lot of research on what you're about to hear tonight about science and our media today and how we're communicating it. How has it changed? What's it going to look like moving forward? So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming tonight's speaker.
Thank you so much for having me and for the kind introduction. We were just talking, Kate and I were just talking. I grew up in Germany, and this morning I was Skyping with my parents, and I was telling my mom that I was doing a talk tonight, and she told me that I should shave before I came. So that didn't work so well, and so I apologize. I didn't do what my mom told me to do. It's never a good idea. But what I want to tell you a little bit about is the kind of work that we're doing at Wisconsin, especially in the Department of Life Sciences Communication, which is an interesting department because we're a communications unit, so a social science department in a College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, which a lot of the old land-grant schools have. So Cornell has one, we have one. So the idea that what we do in a university by definition needs to translate into the state and into the country. When Lincoln and other people thought first about land-grant universities, they were talking explicitly about the idea that unless we teach farmers and other stakeholders how to, and this was a direct quote, how to grow 2 blades of grass instead of 1, we're not doing a good job. Meaning unless we take what we research and take it to the community, we don't do a good job. So a lot of the work that we do deals with exactly that. How do we take knowledge, how do we take what we research and get it across to an often not very interested lay public? And this idea, of course, is not new, right? The idea that interface between what we do and where the public is in crisis. I put a picture up there of Galileo Galilei, who was, one of the first examples of getting in trouble with raising concerns at the interface of science and religion and science and the public. So I want to tell you a little bit about that, and then I want to tell you where we are right now, meaning where I teach a class of 150 students, none of whom have ever seen a printed paper, none of whom will ever subscribe to a printed newspaper, none of whom have ever paid for news. They don't even have a cable hookup. If they watch shows, they watch it on Hulu or other online services where they ideally get everything for free. And it has certain advantages and has certain disadvantages. And I will tell you a little bit about what we've researched, what that does. And then I want to leave you with just 1 or 2 thoughts about what that means for what universities need to do and what I think all of us need to do. So let me start with that public science interface being in crisis. And there are, I think, a few issues that are novel, that are new. And one of them is the idea that science is probably now more politicized than it's ever been. Meaning that there's the line that used to exist, and again, I talked about Galileo Galilei, but the line that used to exist between the ivory tower and what is going on in Washington or in capitals all across the globe, all over the globe, is increasingly blurring. Let me just give you a few examples from recently. Michael J. Fox, some of you may have seen him do advertisements for Governor Doyle when he ran for re-election around stem cell research, something that Wisconsin has invested a lot of money in with Jamie Thompson and a lot of the stem cell lines that were developed here at Wisconsin. But of course, that has become a big political issue with people at different sides of the political aisle pushing for or against stem cell research. Michael J. Fox ran ads in Wisconsin. He ran ads for Claire McCaskill in Missouri. He ran ads at the national level, really politicizing the issue. Climate change, an issue that for some weird reason splits the US into 2 halves. Half of us believe that climate change is is exaggerated, doesn't exist. Half of us believe that it's a problem that we need to fix. And all of that tends to be in direct contradiction to scientific consensus, which believes, yes, it's a problem, and yes, we better fix it soon. And of course, Chris Christie, who some thought would be a front runner for the next Republican ticket for president, made the big mistake of taking Obama around after Superstorm Sandy hit New Jersey, and then politicized the issue further and got punished by Fox News for that. Even obesity we've managed to turn into a political issue. When Michelle Obama said that maybe we should all eat a little bit more healthy, and especially school lunches should be more healthy, got into deep trouble with, ironically, Chris Christie, who I just mentioned, and Mike Huckabee defending her, saying, look, she may be onto something and we should think about it. Synthetic biology is an issue that will be the next big investment in the US. Right now, most of the big agencies are thinking about that as the next round of funding across the board. So the idea that we don't look at biology from top down with microscopes trying to figure out what the smallest parts are, but we're thinking from the bottom up. Can we actually build organisms that don't exist yet in nature? Can we do that by combining nano and other things? And here you see when J. Greg Venter, who helped decode the human genome, sequence the human genome, when he in 2010 put an artificial genome in a bacterial cell, and what he called jump-started life, created life in the lab. This was the cover that we saw. And you can't see it really well, but this is Frankenstein in a test tube. And I'll come back to that later on. Because that immediately says, look, we're going too far. We're overstepping boundaries. And then GMOs, of course, are back on ballots in California, Vermont, and so on and so forth. Again, what is climate change on the right, with denying a lot of scientific consensus, is GMOs on the left, denying a lot of scientific consensus. And I just wanted to put those out because they basically set the stage for why we're here and why we have such a hard time getting modern science across to lay audiences. And there are three problems that are exacerbated by them. Problem number one is most of us know very little about most science, period. And you guys may be the exception. Many of us who are in university settings may be the exception. But for the general public, that's not new. In fact, if you ask the American public on election day, it's really, really depressing. If you ask the American public, not just the voting public, but the overall American public on election day to accurately place the two presidential candidates relative to one another on gun control, meaning which one is more in favor or more opposed to gun control, just under 60% of the American public cannot accurately do that. Which is an answer you should guess. You should be able to guess, right? Even if you have never heard of either candidate. If that's Obama or Romney or whoever else, you should just, based on partisanship, you should be able to guess that. The good news is that most of them don't go vote either, right? So that's but if that's your glass half full attitude, then we have a larger problem. The much bigger problem, though, is not that we don't know anything about science. That's not very surprising because there's so many areas of science. Every 9 years, we double the knowledge of what we know in science. Every 9 years, we double the body of existing knowledge. Of course, you can't know everything. That's not the question. The question is, can you judge good science from bad science? Can we all do that? Here's the numbers. About a third of Americans do know what a randomized experiment is. So if I show you a good study and I show you a poorly done study that doesn't do randomization, the vast majority of Americans can't really tell the difference. Same thing when we ask them, do you understand the concept of a scientific study? Only 1 in 5 Americans can accurately pick what's involved in terms of systematic data collections and so on. So the vast majority of us just don't know what good science is versus bad science. And that also tends to lead to what I call fuzzy policy stances, borrowed from George Bush 43, the language. So we ask in national surveys, we've asked this twice now, and it doesn't get better. We asked them if people think that it's true or false that the Obama administration has recently banned all synthetic biology research. And the answer is it's false. There has been no ban on synthetic biology. In fact, that's one of the largest investments that we're making. This is where the answers are. About a third of Americans get this right. The good news is half of them admit that they have no clue, so that's the good news, but that still leaves us with about 2/3 of the American public who don't know the correct answer to this. So when it comes to science or science policy, most of us don't know all that much. So that's problem number one. We have a public who is not very knowledgeable about either the process of science or the policy implications of that. Problem number two is that we're in the middle of what some people have called a nano-info-biocogno revolution, especially the National Science Foundation. So one of our big funding bodies has talked about this. We're having new areas that emerge at, again, nanotechnology, which is 1 to 100 nanometers, with a nanometer being a billionth of a meter. So this is, smaller than, you can't use a regular microscope. You need to use an atomic force or a scanning tunneling microscope where an atomic tip scans the surface, and then you see what that structure looks like. So really smaller than ever before. We can make molecular changes that we were never able to make before. But also the interface of biology, of nanotechnology, of neuroscience, of cognitive science, of information science. So all of this going together, creating these new things. You've heard about big data. Maybe you've heard about some of the other things. So this is an example from the University of Pennsylvania, building with nanotechnology and with building some of the insights from neuroscience, robots who are self-aware. They fly in formation. If one of them drops out, another one fills the formation, right? So if you've ever seen Terminator, the movie, I hope you haven't, it's not a very good movie, but if you've ever seen them, or the series of Terminator movies, that's exactly what we're talking about. Self-replicating robots who fill in if one of them drops out, self-aware, formation-aware, and so on. And there are basically three things that happen with that science. A, it's highly complex. Meaning, I don't understand I've never learned about nano in school. I've never learned about synthetic biology in school. Yet I'm expected to know all the things that are possible with it. Number two, the transition from bench to bedside, meaning from when we develop these things to when they end up in pillboxes on our bedside, is faster than ever before. We've had 1,500 consumer products on the market in nanotechnology before people even knew that nanotechnology existed. The large chemicals like BASF and Höchst invest 90+% of their R&D budget in nanotechnology, without most of us even having the slightest clue what that means and so on. But most importantly, and this is what we talk a lot about in DC and elsewhere, is the idea of these LC implications, these ethical, legal, social implications. So what all these new technologies do is they push the boundaries of what we should or should not do. Should we create life in the lab? Can we patent genes? Legal implications, right? We had the Myriad case in front of the Supreme Court. Is it possible to patent a human gene? We're about 5 years away from writing genetic material in genome from scratch, meaning we don't examine it, we're writing it from scratch. Well, once I can write it from scratch, can I patent whatever I come up with if it's a human gene? And of course, my response would be, no, you can't. But that's a regulatory question. It's a political question. It's a religious question. It's what's very often referred to as ethical, legal, social, LC implications. So that's problem number two. Problem number three is that brave new world. And that is that we saw 20, 30 years ago, we saw all the small papers getting rid of their science writers if they had any. About 20 years ago, we saw the mid-sized papers getting rid of their science writers. We've benefited in universities greatly from that because some of our best journalism professors are people who got laid off by mid-sized papers. That's really horrible, but it really helped us in terms of training better students. The problem is, and this is where we are now. The New York Times got rid of their green blog. They got rid of their environmental desk. Rick Weiss left the Washington Post. Barnaby Fader left the New York Times. CNN got rid of their whole science staff with Miles O'Brien a few years ago. A couple years ago, 1.5 years ago, Ken Weiss took a buyout from the LA Times. We've now covered almost every single big paper. And then Dan Vergano just took a buyout from USA Today. So these are the people who took this highly complex science that most of us don't understand and translated it into 300 words. Or maybe 800 words, but into words that we can understand. They're all gone. They're no longer working for their organizations because we don't really have good science journalism anymore in this country. So that's the third problem. We have a public who doesn't know much, highly complex, fast-moving science with lots of LC implications, and we've lost the translators. That's where we are. And that's one of our key problems. And this is where part of the reason for that. Part of the reason is where our media use has gone. And I grew up reading a newspaper. I'm sure so have all of you. A print newspaper is still how what news looks like for me. Well, if you ask people, and this is taken out of a National Science Board survey, if you ask people where's their primary source for current news, you still see that TV is one of the biggest chunks. It's still the leader, and then the internet already comes in as a close second. This is across the US population. When you ask them, how about science and technology? Not current news, but science and tech, you see the internet gaining importance and already becoming more important. When you ask people, where do you find, looking on a particular technology, nano, synbio, whatever it may be, it's all internet. And if you look at it as a cohort effect, meaning as those of us who get older, we still have mixed media diets. We still read a newspaper, we watch television, we go to the internet every so often. If you look at younger cohorts, younger generations, it's all internet. It's all on their mobile, it's all on their mobile phone, it's all online sources. And that's part of the explanation for why all those science writers in the previous slide are gone. Because young audiences are used to getting news for free. They're not used to paying. They look for an article in the New York Times and they find it online. And if they don't find it online, they don't read it. It's that simple. And I tell you, I go into my class, 150 kids, and I ask them where they get their news. That's exactly the answer they give me. And all the data support this. And some of it is not bad. So that's what I want to start out with. Some of that brave new world is actually is exciting. And at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, about, I want to say, now almost, well, over 30 years ago, we developed this thing called Mosaic. Academia actually developed this thing called Mosaic. And some of you may remember this was the very first web browser. It ran on Unix. This is what became Netflix. This is what became Internet Explorer. This is what became Firefox or Chrome. So anytime you go online, you click on a browser, it will still use code from this, developed at Urbana-Champaign. And at the time, that was exciting. And it was exciting for two reasons. And a lot of people, especially in my discipline, were very, very excited about this. Because basically, it promised two things that we've never had. It promised, number one, the idea that we can now have information available to us in ways that are fast, meaning I don't have to walk to a library. Right? I can get it quickly right now. My mobile phone is sitting over there. I can look it up. I can get more information than ever before. It's not constrained by what UW-Madison has in the library. I can get anything. And I can get it no matter where I am. So we're making information available to everybody at any time. If that's Wikipedia or if that's WikiLeaks, if that's libraries, if that's Google Books, we can get information now more easily than we've ever been before, or than we ever had before. And that's a good thing. The second key promise was that, look, this is not just, we used to talk about mass communication, meaning a small group of people would tell all of us what the news were. There were three guys who read the news on ABC, CBS, and NBC, and it all looked the same. They had the same correspondence. They read the same types of news, right? Now we're in a world where, and this is Web 2.0. That's the idea of Web 2.0. Well, we can talk to each other. We can discuss the news. We can criticize news. And remember Dan Rather when he went after George Bush because he thought he had documents that had shown that Bush was missing in action in Texas during the war and that he had intentionally done certain things. And basically, he lost his job because bloggers figured out that those documents were fake and wouldn't let the issue go. And bloggers went after him and eventually killed him off. Trent Lott, if you remember him, who made some statements about Strom Thurmond that some considered racist, and basically blogs and online media killed him off. He had to resign because they kept that alive. So that idea that we have a much more horizontal structure of news now and much less vertical than it used to be in this mass communication age is not necessarily a bad thing. It's something that a lot of people are really excited about. And some episodic evidence suggests that this is working. Let me just show you around two big misperceptions that we have. Misperception number one is this: Barack Obama is a Muslim, right? Who just, I mean, for those of you who don't follow the surveys, still about 25%, 20 to 25% of Americans believe in regular surveys. And of course, the New York Post doesn't help, right, by saying, well, he gets a bum rap for allegedly being Muslim, but of course they make that statement by showing him one more time in that outfit. The second one is a more interesting one, and you can think for yourself if you would have thought this or would have thought about it this way. This is Sarah Palin, who a lot of people think has said that she can see Russia from her house, which she actually never said. The person who said this was Tina Fey. And so what Sarah Palin did say is she talked to CBS and they asked her what her foreign policy experience was after doing a half-term governorship at Alaska, right? And her answer was, well, Alaska is actually really close to Russia. In fact, there are parts of Alaska from where you can see Russia, which is, correct. Not sure that translates into foreign policy experience, but that's a different problem. But she did say, I can see Russia from her house, right? And she did say that on Saturday Night Live, a comedy show. The funny thing is, of course, when Sarah Palin thought about briefly running for president again the last time around, Fox News by accident, when they announced that, used a picture of Tina Fey. So even Fox News got that wrong, which is kind of funny. But here's the numbers. So this is national survey data. We're asking people, do you think that it's true or false that Obama is a Muslim, that Sarah Palin was the first person to say, I can see Russia from her house? 21%, very much in that range, right? So in our 70%. 7 out of 10 Americans are convinced that Sarah Palin said, I can see Russia from her house. Which, again, I mean, you can hold a lot of things against Sarah Palin, but that's not one of them. She did not say that. And so what we then did is, so we correlate these things. So we run what's called a multinomial logit, right? So we're looking at essentially at the probabilities going up or down the more people use these different types of media. Traditional media diets, this is your newspaper television diet. Comedy, this is Stephen Colbert, Jon Stewart, kind of the late night comedy programs on television. And then really relying mostly on web sources, on web news. This is what happens with traditional comedy, meaning the more you use it, the wronger, if that's a way of describing it, the more wrong your stances get, meaning the more incorrect your perceptions get. And this is where the positive news or the silver lining comes in. Actually, the web does just the opposite. It allows you to look at information, to click on links, to see what the background story is. And maybe you read a lot more than just seeing that clip again and again and again of Tina Fey. So ultimately, the more you use some of these sources, the more accurate your perceptions get. And that's actually a good sign, controlling for demographics, controlling for partisanship, controlling for other types of media. So that's the plus side. That's the silver lining in many ways. But as a German, I have to end on a negative note, so I'm going to now go to the more depressing parts. Two of them that are that we've done a lot of work on and that are increasingly becoming, I think, open questions for us. And one is what I would call augmented selectivity. So the idea that I said earlier, with these new information environments, it's easier and easier to find any piece of information that you want. So we should be more and more informed than we've ever been, right? Well, the problem is it's also easier than ever before to avoid anything you don't want to hear. And people have called this the filter bubble or echo chambers, meaning if I am a strong conservative and I only want to hear conservative news, I can do that very, very easily. I can pre-select stuff. I can only listen to certain channels on talk radio. Same thing on the Democratic side, by the way. Not any different. It cuts both ways. What Sean Hannity is in Fox is Rachel Maddow on MSNBC, right? It's exactly the same business model. So how does that work? Well, the first one is what some people have called algorithms as editors, right? And this is the idea that news selection is happening less and less by conscious editorial choice, and it's happening more and more by algorithms. If you read a story in the New York Times, in a Sunday New York Times, it will have run on the web page for at least 48 hours, meaning by the time they have to put it in print, they know where it has to go, how many clicks it got, how deep people read into it, how many layers they read into it, and so on and so forth. So in other words, we're using all of our behaviors. If I take my phone and I read something, every click that I will make is going to be recorded. Everybody will know exactly what I look at and what I've clicked on. That determines what news gets presented as prominent and what gets presented as less prominent. News stories move from the front page of the Washington Post 3 levels deep because nobody looks at them. So it used to be an editor telling us what is important and making a choice for us because it's an important topic, is now us and popularity determining what we end up looking at, and there's some downsides to that. So algorithms as editor is number 2. The second one, of course, is that we've all, most of us have gotten into this whole idea of really logging into most of the services that we're using with some form of password. If that's Facebook, and I'm not sure how many of you end up using Facebook, certainly not as much as my students who use it during class. But Facebook has now 1.5 billion users. That's 1 in 6 people in the world, and it's a medium where a good chunk of us get actually news from our Facebook feeds, where a lot of us get well, actually a majority of our news from our Facebook feed. If you print out your Facebook profile, and somebody in Europe, a number of people in Europe sued Facebook for access to their profile, and under European laws you can do that. You print it out on a sheet of paper, on sheets of paper, it'll be 700 pages long. Meaning everything you've ever done, every click you've ever clicked on, every picture, how long did you leave that picture open? When did you close it again? Did you like it? Did you comment on it? Who else did? Meaning if 2 of us in this room had the exact same Facebook friends, I don't mean the same group of friends, I mean the same friends, we would not see the same news feed. Why? Because we've behaved differently. Because I looked at this one picture that you didn't look at. Because I commented on this one thing. So basically, news is now tailored to all of us as individuals. And I often tell my students, and don't yell at me and throw stuff at me, but I don't care about baseball at all, right? I just don't. I didn't grow up in this country. I grew up in soccer. So for me, World Cup was the biggest thing, right, in a long time. But the thing is, it makes no sense to give me any news about baseball. I don't care, I don't watch it, I think you have to, as I said, I think you have to grow up with it. So why would the New York Times give me news on Facebook? And the answer is they shouldn't. It makes no commercial sense, right? Because I'm not going to stay there, I'm going to not look at the advertisements and so on. This is the holy grail of marketing, is what's called micro-targeting, meaning targeting toward you as a person, not toward you as a demographic who potentially has certain preferences, but I don't know. Because I'm collecting terabytes of data on you every single day. With every click, with every credit card swipe, with every phone call you make, with every location. If you ever want to be really depressed, look at the location data that your Android phone collects on you, and it will know exactly where you were at any given time. And you can look at what your day looked like. Those are 2 of the big developments. Well, how do they translate? Well, so what we looked at is, so this is what media do to us, but what do we do ourselves? So what we do is we give people in large-scale experiments, so these are national surveys, and then we randomly assign people to conditions. And we give them stories about science. In this case, nanosilver and food. So nanosilver has antimicrobial qualities. We can buy food containers that have nanosilver built into them, so the food spoils less quickly, but it also is potentially exposed, again, to antimicrobial or nano-sized silver. So we let them read the story. They all read the same story. But then we tell them, well, before we ask you a few questions, you can look up at some follow-up materials, news coverage. And so they get a random selection of news stories. So everybody sees the exact same news stories. They're randomly assigned. The only thing that's different is we give them 3 kind of ideological cues, meaning we tell them it's either from Fox News, it's from MSNBC, meaning on the left, or it's from the Canadians, which we think is neutral, right? Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. So basically, this is totally randomized, so the content is totally controlled out. So the only cue that they're really getting is it left, is it right, or is it neutral? And then we look at what they predominantly go to. So we track what they do. And there's a level of complexity in there, an additional level of complexity. We actually throw off their ideological cueing a little bit by giving them slightly different stories. But in this case, the only thing that we're interested in is what do they turn to? Do they turn to content, or do they turn to ideology for science issues? And this is how it plays out. If you look at this is how liberal or conservative people are. We ask them on a 7-point scale, would you place yourself in the very liberal end or the very conservative end? And you can think for yourself where you would place yourself on that scale. And then we look at the selection rate, meaning where do you go first? So we give them this list of articles. We do that 3 or 4 rounds of that. But what is the first click they make? After they've read about a story they know little about, a science that's highly complex, where do they go first? This is where Democrats go, meaning the more Democratic, the more likely you are to go to MSNBC. This is what Republicans do, meaning the more conservative you get, or what Fox, the more likely you are to go to Fox News. So in other words, all of us end up, even for science, if we're given a chance and if we're given a choice, we're turning to ideologically consistent stories. Really, really depressing, right? It's not just that they select for us. I can blame Rachel Maddow and I can blame Sean Hannity, but we do the same thing. This whole idea of selective exposure, we do the exact same thing. We turn to the sources that fit our pre-existing ideology best, especially when we're confused or when we're not quite certain about the science. Now think about that first slide, and I said GMOs, I said obesity, I said synthetic biology, I said nanotechnology, all these issues where we're not quite certain what the science tells us. This is how we find our security blanket, by turning back to where we feel safest. And in addition to selecting, what we also do, and this is a fairly recent development in psychology called motivated reasoning. And what motivated reasoning says, again, it says about all of us. Motivated reasoning says we don't objectively look at new information. We look at new information using the filters that we have in our heads, meaning using the values political scientists call the priors, meaning our prior beliefs. And we end up, and this is kind of, let me put this here, we end up doing 2 things. We weigh information more heavily. So if I give you 5 facts here, you're going to weigh more heavily the facts that fit your pre-existing ideas and less heavily the facts that contradict it. Sounds really simple, but it actually is something that all of us do. I put a picture here of one of the doomsday scenarios and when the world is going to come to an end, because these people, I'm guessing, engage in a lot of motivated reasoning because they have to figure out on a fairly regular basis why the world didn't come up to an end even though they predicted it. But the important conclusion of this is motivated reasoning means, for all of us, that the exact same piece of information, if I put it in front of you, will mean different things to different people depending on what your prior beliefs are. Just to show you this really quickly, we did a study of biofuels and attitudes toward biofuels in Wisconsin. A big issue for us, right? Especially corn-based ethanol. And we basically looked at what happens if we give people more information. So this is a survey data. We group people into 2 groups, people who don't use news a lot, who don't get a lot of information, and people who get a lot of information. And then here, what I plotted for you is, do people think that biofuels have a positive economic impact on the state? Yes or no? Meaning, do the positive benefits outweigh the risks, or do the risks outweigh the benefits? So if you go negative, it means see more economic downsides, and if you go positive, more upsides. And again, I broke down, this is the priors, right? This is, do Democrats take the exact same information differently than the Republicans do? And then broke it down by TV and newspapers. This is where Democrats are. The more information they get, the more positive effects they see. They actually think that biofuels is a good thing economically. Republicans, being exposed to the exact same media diet in Wisconsin, State Journal, Cap Times, various local papers, and so on, opposite. Meaning the exact same information produces absolutely opposite results. And we're seeing this across the board, not just in Wisconsin, and we see this nationally as well. That if you give more information to culturally or politically highly polarized groups, it drives them even further apart. That's why we have 2 publics on climate change. That's why we have 2 different realities on climate change, if you will. So that's the idea of motivated reasoning. It's not just that we select different news. It's that if we get the same news, we interpret it differently. And that's, of course, easier and easier to do with a highly fragmented online news environment. Just to leave you with one idea here, the last one on this issue, some Italians are actually trying to, and this was in MIT Technology Review, a really interesting study. What they were trying to do is create an algorithm that counters that. Meaning they would use all your online data, they would use all your profile data from Facebook, from whatever else, and then it would calculate how likely it is that you're conservative or liberal, and then they would feed you news that is just the opposite of that. Right? And so that's their solution, which of course commercially will never be successful, and so on and so forth, but I still wanted to share the idea because I actually like the idea just for the sake of it, and Franz Kafka at some point said you should only read books that pinch and bite you, right? You should only read things that really upset you, that question your belief systems. And I think he said that use an ice pick to open up the ice around your heart. And in many ways, this is what this is, right? This is the stuff that really rubs you wrong if you're against healthcare or Obamacare, however you want to call it, the Affordable Care Act, then this one will feed you news in favor of it. And if you're in favor of it, this one will feed you news against it to force you to counter-argue, to think through your policy options. So that's problem number one. Problem number two, really quickly, is the idea that news are no longer what they used to be in terms of isolated news. You don't read the newspaper anymore by yourself in the morning. And we still do, I do. But if you read it on a tablet, you will immediately know what other people think about it because it's been retweeted, because it's been liked on Facebook, because there will be comments underneath. And we were wondering, well, what does that do? And I just gave you two examples here. I mean, if you look at CNN now has gotten to the point that their viewership has dipped to a point where they just read out tweets sometimes because they just have absolutely no content left anymore, or they just run them in the crawler down here. Google News, Apple News, all the online platforms are trying to essentially surround TV shows with social news. You can't watch television anymore without having a Twitter hashtag at the bottom. In fact, Twitter right now is trying to establish themselves as an alternative to Nielsen ratings. So basically, by measuring how often certain hashtags from shows get retweeted, they measure how far the reach is and how long-term the reach is and so on. But basically, what we're having is news that is, and I often, when I explain this to my students, I talk about, it used to be that I'm sitting at a breakfast table with a newspaper and I read it by myself. Coffee, it's nice, it's quiet, some classical music on, that's it. Now, in this brave new world, it's me sitting in the middle of a town square reading a paper and total strangers come by and yell in my ear if the story makes sense or not. Meaning these anonymous comments that surround the story, right? They give me the thumbs up, the Facebook like, yes, 100 of them say this is a really good story. That's what it looks like. I can't read stories anymore without this context, and it tells us, and we know this from social psychology and from communication, that this gives us important cues. If a lot of people tell us something is great, we are more likely to believe that it's great. Does it make any sense? Popularity? Not so sure. There's Justin Bieber, there's some people, Paris Hilton, who strongly contradict the idea that popularity equals quality, but still, that's what we tend to believe. So what we did is, again, a big experiment. And what we did is, again, we used a survey experiment hybrid. So again, it's usually 3,500 people. And this is web-based surveys. We're using actually a supplier, I should have mentioned this earlier, out of California, who looks at the online population and gives everybody who doesn't have online access, which is still about 10–20% in the US, a web TV or some form of access in exchange for doing surveys. So it's fairly representative. And we basically, again, Canadians are our default neutral people, so we use a Vancouver Sun blog, again, about nanotechnology. And we basically give people the exact same news story. And then we give them, basically, so the same stories. We vary the reader comments. They're all artificial. They're all made up, right? And so basically, they read these comments by readers. These comments are exactly constant in terms of the content. So people are saying, well, nanosilver is dangerous for these and those reasons, or it's safe, or it's beneficial for these and those reasons. The only difference between condition 1 and condition 2 is the level of civility. So, meaning people yell at each other in an unfriendly, impolite way, or they're fairly civil to one another. I strongly disagree with you, this makes no sense. I strongly disagree with you, you idiot, that makes no sense. Right? That's the difference. That's the degree of the difference. It's name-calling and incivility. This is what happens. Number one is more uncivil stories increase the perception among all of us, or among many of us, that the news story was biased. Let that sink in, because this is Rick Weiss writing a story for the Washington Post. A totally perfectly objective, neutral story. And there's a bunch of people afterwards yelling and screaming at each other with anonymous handles, yelling and screaming at each other. And all of a sudden, our perception is Rick Weiss didn't write a biased story. Didn't write an objective story, wrote a biased story. More importantly, though, it influences our perceptions of the technology itself. And again, this is not the content of these comments. That's held constant. Everybody saw the same arguments, pro or con. It's just the level of civility, meaning if we start yelling at each other in this Web 2.0 content, we end up seeing the technology potentially as more risky. Those of us who saw it as risky get polarized in one direction, the the others in the other. And the interesting thing was the outcome of this study. So we wrote this and then ended up writing a piece. Well, let me actually show you this example first. This is actually our study was best case in point. This is the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel writing up the first article in our study. Online comments, hurt science literacy study shows. Slightly off in the conclusion, but that's fair. And then, it's sitting at the bottom of the page, right above the weather, with a jump, well hidden, like good science stories are in the newspaper. This is what the online version looks like. Slightly different title, ran about the same time. And this is the interesting thing. Immediately, I know that 171 people have commented. Immediately, I know that 1,000 people liked it on Facebook. Immediately, I know that it's been retweeted 538 times. So immediately, I know that this story, I can't tell it from here, but I can tell it from here, that there is a strong public reaction. Let me show you some examples, because those are statements about us. So these are some of the comments that were made about us in our study. I just highlighted the best parts, because this is the study, meaning our study, by pointy-headed scientists, 99% of whom are socialists and communists. So that's us. Second comment, Wisconsin professors that are bewildered by science opinion being questioned rather than being accepted as told. Again, that's us. Completely misunderstanding the point of the study, but still making the point by having a nasty comment right after. And then this is my personal favorite. Anyone who aspires to this conclusion, meaning ours, hates God and our country. Why is that such an important indicator? Well, the reason why this was such a great illustration of what we were saying in the first place, which was these nasty comments following the story end up changing the interpretation, is because of what ended up happening. I think the pinnacle of my academic career is to have made it into The Onion. It doesn't matter if I've published in Science and Nature, this is by far the best. And The Onion, which wrote this great article that, awful online comments hurt understanding of news reports, local news site filled with awful online comments. But the funny thing about this story, total side story, is that The Onion got, and many of you know this, right? It started with 2 UW-Madison students and then moved on to New York. But The Onion actually got the social science right to the point. I mean, there was no other media outlet that got our study summarized as well as The Onion did. And I'm not joking. This is actually, that's quite serious. And so that was actually really nice to see. But then really all hell broke loose, and it started with a piece that we wrote in the New York Times, an op-ed that we wrote in the New York Times called This Story Stinks, where we essentially, and this is my colleague Dominique Broussard here at Wisconsin and myself, and where we labeled this the nasty effect, saying we are moving into an environment where news is at a point where we don't interpret news anymore objectively, but where just the tone with which we interact about stories can change the interpretation of news. Then popular science ended up coming out and saying, this story, meaning this nasty effect, gets us to shut down our comment sections. We now will no longer allow online comments in popular science. We don't allow people to post anymore in online settings, which of course then triggered even more controversy in the New York Times, but ultimately brings us back to this, and that is, why do we have these online comments? What do they actually do for us? Because we used to have this in the 70s. I picked this up ironically at I was at Cornell before, and I used to drive around the lakes and buy stuff at used furniture stores, right? And I picked up this old 1970s copy of Popular Science, of this Popular Science. And this is what reader comments used to be. They used to be 99% were never printed. The 1% that was printed was heavily edited, in part for people being, not civil enough. So we've never had this. We moved there from here. And the question is, we got attacked a lot for promoting what people said is a lack of free speech. And of course, this has nothing to do with free speech. This is something to do with a media organization paying money, spending a lot of money on providing reader sections or comment sections that ultimately hurt the very product that they're selling, meaning objectivity and the credibility of their stories. So what I want to leave you with is, and hopefully I didn't go too far over, is just like 3 concluding thoughts that I think that come out of this. And that is what we as citizens really, I think, need to learn in this brave new world, and competencies that I think are very different from what we needed to have. The first one is, and this is, by the way, a picture of what political blogs look like right now, and how often they cross over in terms of linking to each other. You see some red dots in the sea of blue, and you see some blue dots in the sea of red, but mostly they talk to each other. That's what the two echo chambers are. This is where climate change is on one end and the other. So we need to, as citizens, figure out how we navigate a news environment that is no longer the Cronkites of this world and everybody else, but that's the Rachel Maddows and the Sean Hannitys, who tell us different things. If you want to read a truly good, I think, overview, Rachel Maddow gave a talk at Harvard in 2010 where she talked about that model. And she said, every time I go crazy on Fox News, my viewership goes up. And Rachel Maddow is a very smart woman. She's thinking about this both from a moral perspective and from an intellectual perspective, and she chooses to still do it. But she's very explicit about this. It's about being against the other side that drives our profit margins. And she basically said, we struck gold where traditional media are losing money. The second one is we need to figure out how to have civil debates in these highly polarized environments. Because we do need those debates. Because climate change and all these things don't have easy answers. Vaccinations, GMOs, they don't have easy answers. It's not just that they're safe and we should go ahead. There's very different aspects that are important, and we need to figure out how to do those. And then ultimately, and this is, I think, the most important one, we need to figure out how to have policy debates around the values. This goes back to motivated reasoning, that unite us rather than the ones that divide us. And coming back from an academic, I think we very often take an approach to climate change that is an Al Gore approach. And Al Gore is the worst science communicators. I'm glad I'm saying this on camera. He's one of the worst science communicators out there. Why? Because he has to be right. Because he needs to have his finger up and it's like, you guys, you don't believe in climate change, you're wrong. It doesn't matter if you believe in climate change, if you do the right thing in mitigation and adaptation. I don't have to convince you that I was right all along. Nobody likes to be told that they were wrong all along. Nobody likes this kid who sits in the first row and always knew everything in elementary school or middle school. Right? And that's what Al Gore ultimately is. So the problem for climate change, and this is where Mitt Romney and others have had a much smarter approach, saying, well, what about global competitiveness? What about energy independence? Values that we can all actually buy into. If I can get, and I'm picking somebody from Arkansas, nothing against the state of Arkansas, but somebody who lives in a double white in Arkansas who has never voted Democratic, if I can convince that person that there is a global competitiveness value, that there's an energy independence value in doing climate change mitigation, renewable energies, then that's a policy that we can all buy into. And I think that's the third one that comes out of this highly polarized, brave new world that we really need to think about. How we do all of that, I don't have any good answers for you just yet, but I can tell you the one really exciting thing is that across all the different colleges and all the different departments at UW, there's a lot of really, really smart people working on the answers. So I'm going to leave it with that, and hopefully we have some time for questions. Thank you so much.
Are you all so stunned that there are no Here we go.
Depress the heck out of people.
I have actually, you experience this when you go online to look for information. If you, click on one picture of Kate Middleton, then all of your news becomes about the British royalty, which, frankly, is really annoying. And, it's like, how do I turn this off? I've got to go find something contrary to click on so that I can get them to feed me something else. And, as a user, it's not helpful to me. For example, you might not like baseball, but you might find it of benefit sometime that you happen to have heard something about baseball when someone else in your environment is speaking about baseball, even if you weren't purposefully looking for that information. How do we as consumers control our own world in a way that counteracts what all of these algorithms are trying to do to us?
Mm-hmm. So first of all, I really like the extension that you did on the baseball example, because I think it illustrates. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I live in this country for 20 years. It's probably not a bad thing for me to learn something that surrounds me that is really important, even though I'm not interested in it, right? So I mean, I really like that extension. To just add another one, it's not just that you, and on your ad example, it's not just that you see the same ads. These ads actually get auctioned off while your web page loads, right? So a company can actually bet on the cookies in Super with HTML5, so the latest iteration of the code that's underlying most web pages. You have these super cookies that combine information from different vendors. And so your ads actually get auctioned off while the page is loading, and what goes in there depends on who the highest bidder ends up being. That finds your profile the most interesting. So it's even more depressing than just the pair of shoes that you looked at on Zappos. I think that from a research perspective, the strongest correlate of people having a broad worldview is two things. Both, one is interpersonal and one is related to their media use. Interpersonal is, we find a very strong correlation between people's networks being heterogeneous, meaning people that are not like them. The more we surround ourselves with people that are not like us, the more likely we are to feel efficacious about participation, meaning we feel good about the likelihood of us being able to make a difference. The more knowledgeable we are about politics, and the more likely we are to participate in first place, meaning voting. So being surrounded by people who contradict what you think and what you do is actually a really good thing statistically. Now, how does that translate into media use, which I think gets more to your question? This is what I tell my students, is the correlation we find is the more diverse your media diet, the better. There is The Guardian you can go to. There are these weird websites. And I think, again, it cuts both ways. I think academics very often say, well, you should not just watch Fox News. Well, you should also not just read the New York Times. And Pew just had the Pew Foundation, if you haven't looked at it, and I could have pulled some data for this, has had a really nice graphic of showing what the more liberal-leaning media and the more conservative-leaning media were. And what the diets are that we very often find ourselves in the middle of. And at UW-Madison, a lot of people tend to fall in one camp and not in the other, and I think that cuts really both ways. Watching Fox News on a regular basis and reading the Wall Street Journal is not a bad thing. Neither is reading the London Times or the Economist. Yes, that may rub you wrong every so often, but that's not a bad thing. In fact, rubbing you wrong does two things psychologically. Either you counter-argue and you come up with an even better conclusion around your original attitude, but it's more well-reasoned because you now counter-reasoned all these arguments, or you're convinced that you were wrong, and that's not a bad thing either. So, one way or the other, you're ending up with a better outcome. And that would be my recommendation is, and this is exactly what I do, when I open my Chrome, my browser, there's 10 tabs that open up with media outlets. And I just go through them. Some of them actually, European, just to see what the different takes are. And I think that's very useful overall.
I'm kind of surprised at the power of some people. I love Colbert and John Daly. I love Colbert and The Daily Show. I mean, I just love them. But I've learned since watching them a lot that that's where some kids get all their news. Mm-hmm. I just can't. So they really have such power if you think about it. Now, obviously, they mostly agree with what I believe, so I'm fine. But I don't know what to do to counterbalance that. And is there humor on the other side is what I want to know, because I'd like to listen to it and see if there's anything comparable. Do you know of anything?
That's a fine question. I can take that. I'm hoping I'm not creating a feedback loop by holding this. But so there's actually a really interesting study that a former student of mine who was my master's student at Cornell, who then went on to University of Pennsylvania and is a doctoral student there now. And they just did a study where they showed that it was actually a lot of media coverage surrounding it, that people have significantly higher levels of knowledge about campaign finance reform if they watch Colbert than if they don't. Because for those of you who watch him, he went through this whole idea of creating his own super PAC, right? So Colbert, Working for a Better Tomorrow, that was the name of his super PAC. And so he raised all this money that he then kind of moved around, and kind of totally unregulated money that, that's now legal under new campaign finance rules. I will get there in a second, yeah, thank you. And so so there's a direct correlation between that, and so there's definitely a higher level of knowledge. So it's not all bad. I think that's.
I just want to know if there's a comparable comedy show that does the conservative.
Yeah, I don't know if there is one that's certainly not with the same level of or viewership for that matter.
Yeah,
the question that I ignored.
This isn't even a question as much as maybe a comment. So I don't use Facebook. I know that's pretty harsh, but it seems like too much. I do read the New York Times. I don't watch much television. I do use social media in terms of blog sites and so on. And I came tonight rather than watching the president's speech, which might be why you don't have as big audience tonight as we would normally have here. And I'm rather hoping that I can go back to social media and find his speech somewhere out there.
Sure,
because I heard that the news media wasn't covering it tonight, except maybe for public television. That seems actually kind of like our media not serving us very well. And I don't know whether you can tell me where I can find it afterwards, but it does see, I noticed that as I'm not very wide-ranging, but I do have certain blogs that show up in my email from time to time, and I'm paying attention to them, and I'm thinking, why am I listening to this? I mean, you know, okay, so Sierra Club and Green America and a few things probably have things to say that I might agree with, but, and I noticed the little notes at the bottom which cite their sources if they're halfway decent, so you can go out and see whether what they're telling you, especially Daily Cost, for instance, you know, some of the blog posts there, I think, okay, these are really fun, but are they true? But sometimes they're cited, so you can go out and see whether you're going to get the same story. So how do you make your way through all this? I mean, I like Rachel Maddow, but I don't watch her very often. So how do you make your way all through this to try to figure out what might be a good news source?
Yeah, and so I think the answer is we're still in the middle of that development sorting itself out. Because part of the problem is that you can't just go to a news site and assume. So right, there's a difference. First of all, let me start with that. There's a difference between push and pull, right? Everything you get through an email marketing or email distribution list is probably something that is there for a reason. If you get an Obama, the Obama campaign was the very first campaign that hired a social media statistician, meaning you're not going to get an ask for $25 anymore. You're going to get an ask that's for a very specific amount of money that is determined based on your demographics. Meaning that they run a big regression, they put your demographics in, and at the end it says $17. And that's what you're going to get asked for because that's the highest likelihood of you responding to it. So you're going to get tailored emails already. Same thing is true for if that's the Sierra Club or anybody else. I mean, they're doing the same thing. So there's the difference between push and pull. And pull in many ways, you go to a news outlet, you seek it out by yourself. The tricky part with that is that the idea that we have a single front page, for example, of the New York Times, it's over. There is not going to be a single front page that all of us see. Exactly, and even if you went to the original, I mean, if you go and take out all the additional stuff that already tailors it toward you, and you go to the front page, just newyorktimes.com, even that will be already adjusted in terms of which stories, and so none of us, and there's been a long argument that part of this unites us, that we see the same news sources. Well, that doesn't exist anymore. So even finding that kind of stuff is increasingly difficult, and it's all in flux. So I think, for me, it continues to be part of the solution tends to be looking across outlets and across different countries. It really helps. Looking at the UK, I happen to read German, so I'd read some of the German papers as well. And I think that's really helpful, especially for foreign policy and other things. But beyond that, it's the last thing that I mentioned, a student of mine, Matt Nisbet, who's now at Northeastern University, and I wrote a piece called The Polarization Paradox for a journal in DC. And in that, we talked essentially about the problem that we have in the US with a completely corporate media system. And you can't blame, and all the science journalists that I put up will tell you, they're the first to tell you, look, it's not our job to be teachers. That's not what makes us money. People won't buy the New York Times to be taught facts. They want to have an interesting story. Why is nano exciting? Why is synthetic biology exciting? So they need to make money, period. And we can't attack them for wanting to make money. TV stations need to make money. Websites need to make money. In Europe, in Germany, for instance, you have a very, very extremely well-funded public media system. Meaning at 8 o'clock at night, you will see on primetime opera. You will see science shows. You will see other things. But the problem is you're not going to sell that in this country. It's not going to happen. We're not going to all of a sudden switch to a public media system. So, one of the solutions that has been suggested, we need a better public media system. And I would maybe tend to agree, but that's not going to happen. And it's certainly not going to happen in the next 10 years. So the question is, how do we, I think it really comes back to those citizen competencies at the end. I think we as citizens need to figure out how to do that. And we need to figure out how to find information from different sources that contradicts sometimes each other and us, and ultimately make better decisions as citizens. And that's getting more and more difficult because the Googles, the Microsofts, the Apples, the Facebooks of this world, the idea is to only give us what we want. That's the holy grail of marketing, right? That's to tailor information to the point where we don't leave the information environment. And the last thought I'll leave you with is, that was the idea of soap operas, right? That was Procter & Gamble. This is why we have soap operas. We create media content so you stay and watch the ads. That was the point. And that's the idea of Google, that's the idea of Facebook, that's the idea of Jared Lanier, who wrote a book called You're Not the Gadget, said this very succinctly and basically said, all of us, we're not the customers of Google or Facebook or whatever, we're the product. If you're on Facebook and you're not, so you're off the hook on this one. All of us make Facebook about $5 a month, right? Just simply in terms of, and now multiply this by 1.5 billion people. And so, the kinds of revenues that they produce, which is why their stock is where it is, because basically we're an audience for advertising. And it's totally ending on a much more depressing note than I wanted this to. This is really, I think it's an exciting time. I think it's, especially for those of us in communication, our students, they're going to go in a world with jobs they don't even know what those jobs are yet. And I think it's going to be exciting in many ways, but there's some downsides. So I didn't want to be quite as depressing.
This is our last question.
Some predictions on print media. Where are we going with that? And will we continue to have print media?
Nope. No, we won't. It's just simply not. It's not viable anymore. So we'll see most magazines already going online completely. The more our distribution channels, the fewer people read newspapers, the more expensive the distribution channels get, right? It makes sense for somebody to drive around in your neighborhood in the morning if they have the Wisconsin State Journal, the New York Times, whatever else. So a bunch of papers share the distribution routes. That's getting more and more expensive by fewer and fewer people having them. So it's not cost effective anymore, even for the people who do. And then, of course, you have the production problems. And we had a bunch of presses having to shut down because certain weeklies pulled, because you have The Onion going online. We have the Badger Herald, one of our student papers, going largely online. Paper is just not going to survive. There's some European papers who are convinced that they will continue to survive. I have a graph that I show in my class. If you add up the top 10 circulation papers in Europe, which are much bigger than any papers in the US. The Wall Street Journal is the biggest in the US. Most of the European ones, if you add them all up, and then you multiply them by 5, assuming that 5 people read any given issue, it's still a small fraction of the people who go to Facebook, who go to whatever, who read all these online portals. Print, unfortunately, is toast. It's, and I feel very nostalgic. I grew up on this. That's still the way I read most things. But unfortunately, I wish I had a better prediction, but it's done. So, sorry.
Well, thank you
I'd be
very
happy
much.
to stick around and answer any other questions.
The professor will take questions after this. So please, ladies and gentlemen, let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you for having me.